Okay, so this is a portfolio overview, and we are going to look some at both 2D and the drawing portfolio. And this is really keeping in mind there have been changes to the portfolio this year. So if you were previously familiar with some of the standards, you're going to see a few changes here. Also note, we are going to talk about this many times, especially in the beginning of the course. So this is really just an introduction, and there will be more videos to follow on the topic. So the first thing that I want to make sure that you understand there are two parts of the portfolio that you submit to the College Board. I should also note I do not require you to submit to the College Board, so some students choose not to, that they are taking the course because they're looking for an advanced art course, they want the grade from me, they want to learn more, but they don't want to submit to the College Board. That is your choice. So the two parts. The one part is called sustained investigation, and that equals 60% of your total score. The sustained investigation is made up of 15 images. So you submit your work to the College Board digitally. And so that's why the word images is really important. As we look at examples, what you will find out is it really is 15 images. It does not necessarily have to be 15 separate finished pieces, which we will unpack as we go through this. So those 15 images that you're showing, they need to demonstrate inquiry so that you have some kind of question, some kind of problem that you're exploring throughout your work. Practice, experimentation, and revision, as well as really experimenting with materials, processes, and ideas. The second part is the selected works part. That is 40% of your score. So these are 5 pieces that are physically sent into the College Board. So they do say that you can use the 5 physical pieces, or you can do high quality printed reproductions. I always recommend that you do send the actual piece in. Obviously, if it's a digital work of art, then you get that printed out and that makes sense. Otherwise, if it's a painting or a drawing, I recommend that you send the actual piece in. Those 5 pieces can come from your sustained investigation. So overall, you can have a total of 15 different images, 5 of which should be finished pieces that you're sending in. So that's what I encourage you to do. I don't try and have you do one on top of the other. A little bit more about the sustained investigation and selected works. So the sustained investigation should be guided by questions, which we are going to work on this throughout the course of coming up with what are your questions and how do you show that in your artwork. We'll also look at examples that hopefully will make it clear on what it means to show practice and experimentation, revision, and things like that. You also will have some writing. Don't worry about it. I'm going to help you through that. The other great part about the writing in this course is you are not graded for grammar or spelling or anything like that, but you are required to do a little bit of writing to explain why you're making what you're making and what you're interested in. So the first part, which is what we spend a lot of time on in these first couple weeks, is identifying the questions that are going to guide your sustained investigation. So it's really thinking about what are you interested in and how is that guiding the work that you're creating. You will be describing your sustained investigation and how you demonstrate that through your work with using 1,200 characters. And that will do a little bit of a draft in the beginning, but we actually end up writing the majority of that at the end, which when you see some examples, I think that'll make sense to you. For the selective works, same thing. That's the 5 physical pieces that you're sending in. They have a little bit of writing with those as well, which we will practice. So you have 100 characters for each of these. So you're not writing a lot. It's more like a tweet. So showing how your ideas are visually evident. You have another 100 characters to write about the materials that you used, and then another 100 characters to talk about the processes that you used. The sustained investigation, it is the same. So for each one of your images, you will include the following information: 100 characters to talk about the materials, 100 characters to talk about the processes, and then you will include the size of the piece. So if it is a physical piece like a canvas or a piece of paper, you are going to say what the height and width is. Since this is not a 3D course, you will not need to be including the depth. If it is a digital piece, so if you're doing digital photography or digital drawing, any type of virtual work, you still need to give it a size. You will just give it the size that if you were going to put it on the display, what is the intended size? So we're going to look at some examples, and what I want you to do as you look through these is get out your sketchbook or something to write with. It could be an iPad, it could be a piece of paper, whatever you like to kind of doodle in and take notes in, and something to write with so you can jot down questions that pop into your head as we're looking at these. Looking at the examples might give you some ideas. So if there's something you think of that's inspiring, you can write that down. If there's a material you see that's interesting and you want to try, write that down. So nothing specific that you have to write down, but I do want you to have something there so you can jot some notes as you go along. So all of the images in this presentation that we're looking at are from the College Board. So the College Board is a way to help guide teachers and students along this. They release some sample portfolios and also give you what the student scored and some explanation as to why the student scored that. So this first example, we're going to look through a series of images. I'll give you a couple seconds to look at each one. And this is an example of a sustained investigation. Also important to note, so this is like one piece right here that we're looking at, the text alongside the photo. That is one piece. And this is an example of a 2D design portfolio. So if you are interested in photography, you want to make sure that you are in 2D design. So for a little bit, I'm just going to stop talking here as we go through these images and let you write down some notes. So some things to think about as we look at these images is how are they connected? So writing down some words as to how are they connected to each other. You could jot some ideas of what do you think the artist was exploring? So what was that question? What was that problem? What do you think they were exploring? And do you think that they showed some experimentation? Did they learn something? Or are we seeing the same thing over and over? So how are they connected? What do you think they were exploring? And did they try some new processes, do some experimentation? All right, I am going to be quiet so you can look and jot down your notes. Okay, so I did not show you all 15 pieces. I kind of got a general selection there. So these are questions that you were reflecting on. So what did the pieces have in common? What was similar about some of them? You also will have access to these slides, so you can kind of go back through this at your own pace. What was different about the pieces? And if you had to guess, what do you think the student was investigating. So now we're going to go into and look at the scoring overview. Again, we are going to get more into scoring and how that works at the College Board level as well. This is really our starting point. So this is what the student wrote. So in the beginning of this, I told you that you have 1,200 characters to submit to talk about your sustained investigation. This is an example of the type of thing that you would write. So this is what the student submitted. The central idea of my sustained investigation surrounds the question, what does it mean to be Black? To answer this question, I asked my subjects to write me a paragraph about what it means specifically to them to be Black. I also asked them each to give me 3 words describing how they wish to be portrayed in this project. The work in my sustained investigation explores the idea of what it means to be Black by providing direct answers to the question while still leaving a substantial amount to interpretation. In images 1, 3, 5, 7, 10, and 13, I provide direct accounts of what it means to be Black. So this is right here, and I will help you with this, where they're really pulling out and they're giving that evidence of this is how I did what I said I wanted to do. They're pointing back to specific images and saying, this is how I feel like I showed it. On the other hand, images 2, 4, 6, 9, 12, and 15 are created to specifically portray the 3 words that they provided me. For example, Jamaica told me she wanted to be portrayed as strong. In image 9, she is facing directly towards the camera in a regal way that displays power and strength. So that is an example of what the student wrote and an example of sustained investigation. So this is what they were investigating. What does it mean to be Black? Okay, so this is the score. The highest score that they could get on this is a 3. Okay, so we're seeing right up here what the score is, and then we're going to dive into the rationale. I do want to make sure that you know, so when you submit to the College Board, you actually do not get all of this rationale, which I know can be a little bit frustrating. You just get a final score at the end. The final score at the end is a range from 1 to 5. So 5 being the highest, which I know is a little bit confusing when I just said here 3 is the highest. I honestly don't 100% know the math that they do to figure it out. 3 is the highest you can score on here. They work it out all together. I would say your goal should always be to get a 4 or a 5. So this section is looking specifically at inquiry, and I want you to hear about how the scorers were responding to the students' work. So in the words of the student artist, the images in this portfolio explore the idea of what it means to be Black by providing direct answers to the question while still leaving a substantial amount to interpretation. The student directly asked their subjects, what does it mean to be Black, and prompted them to give 3 words describing how they wish to be portrayed. The student then created multiple portraits of the subject, 1 according to their advice and guidance, and 1 using the artist's own ideas. So this is really an example. They're looking at how was the student showing inquiry. So how was the student asking questions, researching, and digging into it. So an example is they were actually approaching how they did the portrait of a subject in 2 different ways. So this question of what it means to be Black clearly guides the sustained investigation, and it links the conceptual and visual inquiry. Aspects of the work were determined by the answers and guidance that the participants offered, making them collaborators in the work's creation. The visual evidence clearly demonstrates this approach by documenting the subject's responses with their portraits. Image 2, 4, 6, 9, 12, and 15 are images created according to the request of the participants. So this is breaking down how did the student explore their question through the work. So this next section is looking at, was the student practicing? So were they kind of trying new things and experimentation and revising? So they want to see that you are growing, you're developing, you're trying new things as you go throughout your work. So this again scored a 3 in this section, which is the highest they could score, and here is why. The nature of dual approaches in this investigation provides immediate evidence of practice, experimentation, and revision. So what they mean by that is the fact that the student took 2 photos of every subject, and they did it one by trying to portray them how the subject wanted to be portrayed, and then the second way more how the photographer wanted to portray them. That naturally was showing evidence of practice and experimentation and revision because they were photographing the same person in 2 different ways. Each figure is depicted twice, revealing experimentation with the number of ways in which a subject might be presented. Within the set format of creating a body of portrait-based work, the student has left ample room for ongoing practice and revision with a small set of photographic techniques and ideas. Some photos are close-ups, some are full body, some are shot inside, some out, some are at night, some during the day. That again is showing experimentation because of different types of composition, different types of lighting situations to deal with. The student adjusted their technique and approach in response to the particular conditions of the portrait. In one series, the student experiments with using black and white photography juxtaposed against black text on a white background. In the other set of portraits, the figures are the sole focus and are seen in full color. The range of choices reflects student practice, experimentation, and revision, but those choices continuously reflect the spirit and intent of the work as a whole, rather than an interest in variety for its own sake. And another section, so this is looking at materials. So what did you use, the processes, how did you use those materials, and overall ideas. This again scored a 3. So if you're picking up, this portfolio scored very well. Emotional or symbolic portraiture is a common theme of investigation in AP portfolios. In this particularly successful example, the student seamlessly merges material, process, and idea by drawing on information from interviews to directly inform the decisions that were made and how the subject would be visually represented. So even their material and process is really photography, but they explored in whether it was black and white or color and added text to some of them. So interviewing people before the photography session is a wise means for the photographer to know what they need to portray, and including the answers as documentary evidence of the process is a compelling presentation. The student wisely alternates the layouts within the portfolio in a way that guides the viewer through the body of the work. The text is perfectly placed with the photo of the speaker that can usually only imply their feelings of being black. The written evidence describes that half of the works provide direct accounts of the subjects, but that other images are created to specifically portray 3 words that they provided me, revealing ongoing experimentation in the ways that the subject of one's work can become collaborators in a creation. In image 7, for example, the subject is standing casually against a wall, peering off into the distance, but in image 9, she stares intensely at the viewer. When conveying their decision-making within the revisions, the students writes, Jamika told me she wanted to be portrayed as strong. In image 9, she is pacing directly towards the camera in a regal way that displays power and strength. In the process of choosing certain postures, facial expressions, and settings, the student reinforces the ideas at the heart of this project, showing the dichotomies of both strength and fear, of distrust and pride, of persistence and freedom, of talent and intelligence. And the last category that you are scored on is skills. So that's kind of overall for this one with photography. Do they understand exposure? So are their photos properly lit? Do they understand composition? Visual evidence of good and advanced 2D skills are seen throughout the images. So specific to 2D, we will really be getting into that. It's really looking at the elements and principles of art and how are you using them. Figure-ground relationships are explored within the photos as well as placing them next to the printed word on the page. The minimalism of the simple linear text plays against the complexity of the shapes, layers, space, and colors of the figurative image. Balance is created with symmetry in images 5 and 8 and asymmetry in the others. Color and value contrast successfully bridge the spectrum between the subtle in image 1 and the bold images 4 and 6. These choices help convey concept as well as provide both unity and variety with the image. So unity and variety are principles of design. Color and value are elements of art. as our symmetry and asymmetry. And as I said, we will get into those more and more just to give you a little bit as we go. So now we're going to look at a specific example of drawing to give you some more ideas. So just like the last one, I want you to take some time as we look at these and jot down notes. Do you have questions? Does this inspire you? How do you think the pieces are connected? Or maybe you don't think they're connected. Just reflect on the pieces as we scroll through. So some things you're seeing here, each one of these, they're kind of doing some like bigger view and then more of a close-up cropping, and this is being presented as one image. So again, even though this one we see 3 different things here, the student chose to present this as one image. You have choices in how you decide to do that. So this, what we're actually seeing, a lot of these other pieces, my guess is some are kind of studies leading up to this really, really big piece that we're looking at. Even this kind of close-up little studies trying to figure out mark making, how do the materials go on top of each other. And here, so this you're going to see is very different from the one that we looked at, which is part of the reason I pulled it, because I want to see you to see that there are a variety of approaches that you can use. So here, the student also, some of her images are really showing her process. So here we're seeing her standing up against the piece, which helps us to get an understanding of scale. Here we're seeing her actually working on it and seeing how she made her own super long paintbrush. So that in of itself, we're seeing some experimentation in process. This is also showing us a little bit of her process. So the setup, this is what she's looking at, this is what she's drawing. This I thought was kind of a fascinating process. So here we're seeing she has this kind of tree part and there's paper all around it and setting it on fire and showing the process of that. So working outside. This is another example of a large piece, but in progress. Her working and showing some of her tools. Okay, so as I said, I wanted to pull that one for you because the photography one was really kind of more individual pieces, which you might be more used to, where the second one had some finished pieces, but also was showing a lot of process and background to it. So here is what the student wrote about their work. In my body of work, I allude to elemental forms God used to make himself known. Manipulation of sediments, copy grounds, and water samples are symbolic depictions of vials, a memorial of boundary or control. I create microcosms through my process to depict universal and personal relations with God through demarcation. The use of raw, mundane forms are representative of vulnerability and identity, the body of work. Identify the body of work. What began as a superficial historical analysis of biblical symbol and God's presence, my work transitioned into contemporary documentation, exhibited through large-scale drawings. Analysis of veils in relation to where God dwells is a device that is dependent on vulnerability and control. This is symbolically represented through found water samples, sediment samples, and handcrafted charcoal. Materials and processes are derived from places where personal boundaries are present in physical atmospheres such as creeks, pools, ponds, and homes to allude to the demarcation of communal boundaries. In the second work, I further my discovery of elemental materials using hand-compressed fine charcoal and water samples, which strengthen my relationship to biblical symbolism of natural factions. The burning bush proposed the opportunity of fire, a motif that defines an ultimate power of protection, provision, and promises of death and anguish. Multiple perceptions allow for the veil to be a symbol of discernment that creates unity of division. The physical process of collecting found materials as mediums to create these microcosmic drawings continues throughout the body of work as a risked attempt to exhibit God's grace and power. So you can also see her writing was very different from the other one. Hers really was focusing on her process, her discovery, and her experimentation. So she didn't really point any back to any specific images like the last one did. So this one also scored all 3. So these are 2 examples that scored very well. And looking at inquiry. So here's an example. Again, inquiry is what is the question and how is that guiding the work? And how do we see that demonstrated visually? The student opens the written commentary. Within my body of work, I allude to elemental forms God uses to make himself known. The stated sustained investigation is developed with a rich description that further guides the process that clearly expresses discovery through handmade materials and carefully chosen surfaces. Written evidence offers clear examples of the student's methods of inquiry, noting that manipulation of sediments, coffee grounds, and water samples are symbolic depictions of veils, a memorial of boundary or control. The artist notes the growth of her work over time, sharing that what began as a superficial historical analysis of biblical symbol and God's presence transitioned into contemporary documentation exhibited through large-scale drawings. This inquiry is clearly visually evident in the documentation of ways in which elements of nature can be visually described through mark-making strategies, as in images 1 through 5, as well as the ways in which natural elements can become a part of the tools and processes of the artist. The growth in scale and scope of the work provides evidence of the deepening of the investigation that the student noted in her statement. The next part is practice, experimentation, and revision. So the last one, we saw that happening through photographing the same person twice, but with kind of a different focus and different method. So we're going to look at how do we see that here. This portfolio is a standout example of experimentation and revision pushing the work further, opening the door to new discoveries. The written evidence describes this process of discovery as well. In image 12, for example, the student is showing the process of a burning bush. The student states that this is a motif that defines an ultimate power of protection, provision, and promises, or of death and anguish. The smoke and soot of the bush creates the ground for the drawing, and the charred bush itself is used as charcoal for the creation of subsequent layers. In image 13, the student is drawing on site using materials created from the ground, water, and foliage around her. So these are all ways we're seeing her experiment in the type of materials that she's using, the processes that she's using to create her piece. So experimentation with materials and processes clearly led to revision and expansion of the student's ideas and approach. Then in images 11 and 14, we can see the student making her own drawing materials, using her own handmade brushes, and executing the work in an unconventional way. Materials, processes, and ideas, another 3. So this is really almost how is that all coming together? How are the materials you're choosing, the processes you're choosing, and your ideas working together? Synthesis is clearly evident in this portfolio. So synthesis is really that idea of all of those things coming together, as the relationships among materials, processes, and ideas are inseparably combined. As noted above, the student often worked in nature, gathering materials from the natural world in order to make work about that world, thoroughly integrating materials, processes, and ideas. The practice of making art in the environment of God's creation, as seen in image 13, is further evidence of the student's desire to make meaningful art that is both closely tied to her own beliefs and an appetite to discover meaningful relationships through handmade drawing materials. And the last one is drawing skills. So if you'll remember the last portfolio that we looked at, the last one was looking at 2D design. So because it was for the 2D design, it was really looking at how did the student use the elements and principles of design. Here, we're going to be looking at how did the student use the drawing skills. And that is another part we will get more into of really looking at what does the College Board consider drawing skills or drawing issues, and how do you make sure you're showing those in your art. So the work in this portfolio demonstrates advanced drawing skills. The works display a progressive understanding of layering, texture, mark making, and use of media, from subtler and softer charcoal marks that emulate waves in image 2 to the mixing of media, including ink washes that emulate water, and the creation of large-scale works seen in images 11, 14, and 15, in addition to exhibiting mastery with a variety of materials and processes, both conventional and unconventional. This work also exhibits the development of student voice in identifying the artist's own approaches and techniques for using and combining these materials and processes. So what I want you to do now, and you're going to share these in Google Classroom so that I can be sure to answer them for you, is write down what are 3 questions that you still have about the sustained investigation part of your portfolio. So this was a lot of information. And you are also more than welcome to have more than 3 questions, but I want you to think about those 3 questions. So it could be overarching, something that you don't understand about it, or it could be more specific, as in, can I explore dogs for my sustained investigation? You could be sharing some ideas that you might want to do, but at least 3 questions. Post those in to Google Classroom so that I can pop in and answer them for you.